Hi, my name's Ian, and this is part of a series where we're going into long-form discussions on various editions of role-playing games. The series explores games from the role-playing hobby's history, examining their pros and cons and taking a look at what can be recommended if you wish to give a game a go. With many editions of many games available once more as PDF or print on demand, this series hopes to dispel a little of the confusion spread by so much disparate material appearing on what seem to be very similar banners. This time out, we're looking at the 4th edition of Dungeons & Dragons, actually the 9th edition of the game, when one counts the original 3 primary releases of Basic, 2 editions of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, and 2 further editions, 3 and 3.5, in the modern era of the game directly under Wizards of the Coast. 4E is a little controversial, and is the only edition within its line to, reportedly, lose prominence in the role-playing market, ostensibly to its predecessor, in the guise of Pathfinder. But it does have many good points and a very strong niche, and of course forms a bridge between the extensive rules of 3E and the more accessible form of 5E. The major caveat here, before we start, is that I have little direct experience actually playing 4E, beyond the board games that were derived from it. However, I have owned and read the rules thoroughly and have played it on occasion. I do not enter into this particular review from a position of naivety. It is odd to think that with its wild popularity, 3rd edition became one of the shortest-lived editions of Dungeons & Dragons, beaten out only by 4th edition, and only then if you consider 3E and 3.5E combined. 3E had a lifespan of 8 years, from 2000 to 2008, in comparison to 1st edition's 12 years and the full decade of 2nd edition, and with the announcement of one D&D, 5E. You could argue that 3E is still with us, given that the Pathfinder rules lean heavily on it. However, 4E was with us for a mere 6 years before its party was over, from 2008 to 2014. But I mentioned a relatively short existence of 3E for good reason. I believe that by the end of the 1st and 2nd edition runs, a good section of players, but admittedly not all, and the RPG industry itself was ready for something new. In this, the birth of 4E could have been said to have been premature. 3E was still fairly strong and well received, as can be evidenced by Pathfinder exceeding 4E in popularity for much of its run. In the general populace, a new edition just wasn't looked for, or necessarily needed. But Wizards of the Coast thought otherwise. Driven by the growth of multiplayer online games such as World of Warcraft, first released during 3E's run in 2004, the feeling was that the MMORPG experience could be recreated within the sphere of D&D as a sort of hybrid online and tabletop game that drew on facets developed for MMOs, and much as MMOs had drawn on D&D in the first place for their own foundation. So, the concept of 4E was structured around a balanced, defined role base, with a supporting suite of online tools, including a virtual tabletop. Even back then, virtual tabletops were not a new concept, but integrating a game directly was something novel. Unfortunately, this basis turned out to be tragically flawed, with the actions of one Joseph Batten, senior manager responsible for the delivery of the virtual side of things. Joseph murdered his estranged wife and then committed suicide in 2008, before the promised virtual tabletop was delivered. This left the heavily promoted side of the game dead in the water. Already on the back foot, 4E was released to the tabletop RPG community as another iteration of Dungeons & Dragons. One many saw, as mentioned earlier, as prematured and uncalled for. Some enjoyed the MMO-esque elements constructed into the game. Others, myself included, felt that the game was a spiritual departure from the core concept of D&D. While there is nothing wrong with the game being well-defined and balanced, and often an essential for board games and computer games, there is something that essentially felt wrong with a game carrying the Dungeons & Dragons name being so formed. Following on from the traditional Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide and Monster Manual core books in 2008, Wizards of the Coast proceeded with a fairly heavy release schedule of additional rules volumes, expansions to the Player's Handbook in 2009 and 2010, an expansion to the Dungeon Master's Guide in 2009, 2 further Monster Manuals again in 2009 and 2010. Couple this with many additional expansion volumes, the output of 4E almost rivaled that of 3E in half the time. This led to 4E's third major issue: rapid bloat. Too many options, released too quickly. Perhaps this is something that Wizards eventually came to realise. In 2010, the core 4E rules were pared down into Dungeons & Dragons Essentials, an entry point into the game that was above the level of a starter set, but below the full bore of the core 4E rules and its expansions. The Essential series comprised a rules compendium, a monster vault, a DM's kit, and expansions in the form of Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdoms, expanding on druids, paladins, rangers and warlocks, as well as dragonborn, drow, half-elves, half-orcs and tieflings, and Heroes of the Fallen Lands, expanding on clerics, fighters, rogues, wizards, dwarves, eladrin, elves, halflings and humans. The years 2011 and 2012 were quieter on the 4E front, with a handful of splat books, the Book of Vile Darkness, Mordenkainen's Magnificent Emporium, and the Player's Option series, including Heroes of the Feywild and Heroes of Elemental Chaos, a return to the Forgotten Realms setting with the Neverwinter subsetting, and books describing Undermountain and Menzoberranzan, and the Shadowfell. A far cry from the some 38 books released in the 2008 to 2010 period. Things were apparently tailing off, and this became apparent later in 2012 and into 2013 as releases and playtest material began to emerge for a new edition of the game, initially entitled D&D Next, and ultimately arriving in 2014 as the juggernaut that is 5th edition. It's therefore somewhat interesting to note that even though 4E had a run on paper from 2008 to 2014, its actual release life was but 4 years, 2008 through to 2012. Most of the releases through 4E's short run cannot be said to be significant. There's a lot of reworking of material from 3E, and a lot of expansions to the core rules that add more board game-esque options for characters. With the introduction of card packs describing the various powers possessed by each class and race, the board game feel became reinforced. It looked and felt more like playing a card and dice-driven skirmish board game than a role-playing game proper. However, there are some gems among the endless sea of option books. The Demonomicon, drawn from an in-game famous work by Igwilv of the Greyhawk setting fame, is an interesting book, describing demon history and exploring the abyss, beyond describing lots of demonic creatures with their stat blocks. Apart from the 4E tailored statistics, this book's content is useful for any edition. Similarly, Underdark, which, as you might guess, describes the underground maze that is home to Dark Elves, Kuo-toa and more. The Dark Sun setting, originally published for 2nd edition, received a 4E makeover, and the more action-oriented nature of the setting lends itself well to the general premise of the 4E rules. In fact, it is probably the setting which shows 4E's scope best. Dark Sun, with its focus on psionics and survival, is naturally power-led, and that falls directly into the modus operandi of the 4E system. But now we come to what I feel is 4E's saving grace. Over the years, there have been many attempts at producing a Dungeons & Dragons board game. Some have been more successful than others. Some have served as entry points into the role-playing game. Many have been standalone, and a handful have stood astride the boundary between board game and role-playing game. None of them have held too much in the way of longevity, except one, and that is the Dungeons & Dragons Adventure System series. First published in 2010 as the Castle Ravenloft game, the Adventure System series now amounts to 6 full board games plus 1 expansion game. This is where the foundational 4E mechanics really shine, and is a natural environment for them. While the adventure system is a heavily cut down version of 4E, you can actually have a lot of fun playing the game with the full 4E rule set. To date, the adventure system games include Castle Ravenloft from 2010, Wrath of Ashardalon and The Legend of Drizzt in 2011, Temple of Elemental Evil in 2015, Tomb of Annihilation in 2017, Dungeon of the Mad Mage in 2019, and Ghosts of Saltmarsh, tagged as an expansion, in 2021. If I am going to recommend 4E as a system at all, it is within the context of these highly entertaining, cross-compatible board games. The basic system for 4E follows the consistent format laid down by 3rd edition, which is, to succeed at anything, you roll a 20-sided dice against a target number, a difficulty class, adding various modifiers for ability and expertise. In many ways, this is where the similarity to other D&D editions begins and ends. From there, the differences stack up to a lesser or greater degree. For example, alignment is pared down from the 9 alignments of other editions to 5: good, lawful good, evil, chaotic evil, and unaligned. While these are probably better described, especially within the context of alignments as a universal force, they do present an oversimplification that, admittedly, also fits in with the simplified version of the 4E multiverse. Many people don't like alignment. Having been weaned on Moorcock's works, I happen to be someone that does. Personally, if simplifying alignment is a goal, well, we already have had a successful model for that in basic Dungeons & Dragons, with its use of law and chaos as an axis alone. Check mechanics are generally easy to calculate. Roll 1d20, add half of your character's level, and add the relevant ability score. This means that there are no specific class attack bonuses. The base attack bonus of 3E, for example, is gone. Everyone uses the same basic bonus. This format is used whether it is for an attack roll, a skill check, or ability check. The difference between the classes, what makes a fighter good at fighting, for example, arrives with a set of powers available to each class. And we'll come to that in a bit. One of the design principles of 4E is that every level should mean something. To that end, every time a character gains a level, they gain something. A new power, a new feat, a path feature. Characters can also switch out earlier selections on gaining a level, the equivalent of resetting skill trees in MMOs. Before I get to powers, let's touch on those other 2 character capability descriptors, skills and feats. The list of skills is pared down from 3E and is relevant to adventuring. This is an improvement over 3E's flawed lots of skills model, which, as I noted in my video on 3rd edition, is inherited more from Rollmaster influences than Dungeons & Dragons. The pared down list of 4E is far more useful. Feats are similar to their 3E cousins, providing modifiers or additional features to characters. Feats are available to characters if prerequisites are met, which include the character's tier, heroic, paragon, and epic, based on the character's level. Briefly, a tier is a more codified way than the somewhat informal use of basic, novice, expert, intermediate, high, and epic level terms used in previous editions. In 4E, tier does not just describe a character's level bracket, heroic from 1st to 10th, paragon from 11th to 20th, and epic from 21st to 30th, but also ties into the abilities accessible to characters, feats included. Now, let's get on to powers. Powers in 4E are king. You gain powers through your race, for example, Face Step for Eladrin and Second Chance for Halflings, and from your class. For classes, powers are split into At Will, Encounter, and Daily powers, referring to when they can be used. At Will, whenever you like, Encounter generally only once per encounter, with a bit of a rest in between, and Daily once per day. They are further divided into class features, attacks, and utilities. Features being elements common to a particular class, attacks being methods of hurting opponents, and utilities being buffs, heals, and similar capabilities. At each level, a character learns a certain number of at-will, encounter, daily, and utility powers. For example, a first-level character has 2 at-will, 1 encounter, and 1 daily power, and no utility powers, while at 10th level he has 2 at-will and 3 each of encounter, daily, and utility powers. Powers are given names reflective of the class: prayers for clerics, exploits for fighters, spells for wizards, and so on. These cover the archetypical abilities of classes. For example, cleric prayers deal with turning undead, healing others, and inflicting divine attacks on foes, while fighter exploits focus on weapon attacks and combat special effects. In this way, even while the basic bonuses are the same across all classes, each class is honed into its niche. A 6th level wizard and a 6th level fighter both have a +3 basic attack bonus, but the powers they possess very much push the fighter into fighting and the wizard into chucking spells around. On the subject of spells, gone are the extensive spell lists of previous and future editions. Instead, it's all about powers. Well, mostly. Some of it's about rituals, which tend to be magical effects that are not suitable for powers. You see, powers are all about building a hand of options for your character to play on a round-by-round basis during an encounter. Very board gamey. Not every spell within the Dungeons & Dragons sphere is really suited to that concept. And so, within the rituals, we see spells such as Arcane Lock and Commune with Nature and Speak with Dead, Tensor's Floating Disc, Passwall, Drawmage's Instant Summons, one of my personal favourite D&D spells, and so on. You wouldn't call up a floating disc in the middle of a fight, and so therefore it's a ritual rather than a power. Spells themselves, powers of magic-using classes such as wizards and warlocks, are played as powers. Simple spells, Mage Hand for example, are at-will class features, while Magic Missile is an at-will attack spell. Expeditious Retreat is a daily utility spell, as is Wall of Fog. So, gone is the traditional view of spell slots per level, memorization or preparation of spells, and spells as an exercise in resource management. They are, like the fighting option powers of a fighter, simply part of the character's hand of powers to play as they move their top hat miniature around the board. As characters progress to Paragon level, they select a Paragon path. These paths represent a level of specialization. For example, for wizards, we have Battle Mage, Blood Mage, Spellstorm Mage, and a Wizard of the Spiral Tower. These options provide even more powers, gained level by level from 11th through the 20th levels. At 21st level, a character selects an Epic Destiny, which provides options for the truly superheroic, including aspirations to godhood. In some ways, this resembles the progression of characters through the old Basic and Expert sets, the heroic tier in 4e terms, to Companion, Paragon, and to Master, Epic. In any case, it gives a nice progression tree for characters to develop through. And that's pretty much it. The play of 4e is very much encounter-driven, and is a development on the later 3e adventures where encounter situations were specifically laid out for the characters to play through. This can be mostly readily seen with the published adventures for the game. Even a room-by-room dungeon crawl is broken down into a series of encounters rather than a collection of room descriptions. In comparison to the Adventure System board game, all that misses from the full 4e rule set are the expansive options and full sweep of level advancement. With the Adventure System, your character has a number of cards describing the powers they can use and when, and encounters on the board proceed accordingly. In play, both 4e and the Adventure System games feel pretty much the same, or very similar. Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition is a great set of rules for skirmish and board game-like encounter play. As a role-playing game, however, it falls short of the mark. The main reason here is that it places a huge amount of focus on the play powers-like card system, and characters have very few options to grow and develop beyond that line. The way the game is structured requires players to build the best hands of powers that they can and use them cleverly within play. So, more than even 3e, character optimization is key, and therefore characters become little more than game pieces. The traditional narrative elements of an RPG that lie beyond the encounter are there, but heavily glossed over in favour of the power mechanic. Sure, you can play 4e and have all of the role-playing that you like, but sooner or later you'll be there playing Pokemon or Magic the Gathering while moving miniatures around on a board. it does not lend itself to the purely theatre of the mind play that even 3.5e could pull off. In this regard, 4e is the only D&D edition that screams its requirement for a board. The fact that the adventure system, even though it represents a heavily cut down variant of 4e, is so much fun to play, and 4e itself, within a role-playing context, is not just further evidence that 4e is actually a brilliant set of board game rules, but also that it is a poor rendition of a Dungeons & Dragons edition. The clue is in the name. The Essentials books are probably the best place to start. The Rules Compendium, Monster Vault and DM's Kit initially, and Heroes of the Fallen Lands and Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdoms, if you find you like it. Obviously from there, the full whack of the game, represented by the 3 volumes of the Player's Handbook, 2 volumes of Dungeon Master's Guide, and the expansion books Arcane Power, Divine Power, Martial Power, 2 volumes of that, and Primal Power beckon. For me, if I was going to delve into 4e in anger, it would be Dark Sun all the way. In fact, in writing this review, I feel a hankering to do just that coming on. If you want a taste of what 4e rules are like, then pick up any of the adventure system games. For the most part, these are in print and relatively easy to find. Personally, Castle Ravenloft remains my favourite of these, but they are all good fun. A flawed premise from the beginning. With a horribly unfortunate start in life, 4e was all but DOA. Its rapid bloat of options may have brought some book sales, but its purported outselling by the 3rd edition derived Pathfinder rules would have been a painful pill for Wizards of the Coast to swallow. Thankfully, it had a short life in its full form. Equally thankfully, it spawned the adventure system games, which are a lot of fun and laid down some of the groundwork for 5th edition, including some of the sensibilities such as shortened relevant skill lists. I may not like 4e as an edition of D&D, but I have nonetheless had a lot of fun with it, with its offshoots and its offspring. The next up on the D&D front will obviously be 5th edition when we get there, but ahead of that, probably delving into Traveller and so on. If the polls on my messages part of YouTube are anything to go by, then Twilight 2000 may be coming up too. And I'll put a video up that just runs through those poll results and see where we go from there. And obviously mixed into there will be some more bits and pieces and different videos and ad hoc reviews and this C versus I, or I versus C concept that I want to start putting together for some of the board games that we reviewed and some of the board games that we haven't reviewed yet, but just to show you the mechanics. That's basically going to be me and my son having a go at each other over the board game table. So until the next video, take care, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next time.